2, the element of overpoweringness. Majestas, that's spelled Majestas. We have been attempting to unfold the implications of that aspect of the mysterium tremendum indicated by the adjective, and the result so far may be summarized in 2 words, constituting, as before, what may be called an ideogram rather than a concept proper, viz. Absolute unapproachability. It will be felt at once that there is yet a further element which must be added, that, namely, of might, power, absolute overpoweringness. We will take to represent this the term majestas. Majesty the more readily because anyone with a feeling for language must detect the last faint trace of the numinous still clinging to the word. The tremendum may then be rendered more adequately, tremenda majestas, or awful majesty, A-W-E-F-U-L, awful majesty. The second element of majesty may continue to be vividly preserved, where the first, that of unapproachability, recedes and dies away, as may be seen, for example, in mysticism. It is especially in relation to this element of majesty or absolute overpoweringness that the creature consciousness, of which we have already spoken, comes upon the scene as a sort of shadow or subjective reflection of it. Thus, in contrast to the overpowering of which you are conscious as an object over against the self, there is the feeling of one's own abasement, of being but dust and ashes and nothingness. And this forms the numinous raw material for the feeling of religious humility. Here we must revert once again to Schleiermacher's expression of what we call creature feeling, viz., the feeling of dependence. We found fault with this phrase before on the ground that Schleiermacher thereby takes as basis and point of departure what is merely a secondary effect, that he sets out to teach a consciousness of the religious object only by way of an inference from the shadow it casts upon consciousness. We have now a further criticism to bring against it, and it is this. By feeling of dependence, Schleiermacher means consciousness of being conditioned as effect by cause, and so he develops the implications of this logically enough in his sections upon creation and preservation. On the side of the deity, the correlate to dependence would thus be causality, i.e. God's character as all causing and all conditioning, but a sense of this does not enter at all into that immediate and first-hand religious emotion which we have in the moment of worship, and which we can recover in a measure for analysis. It belongs, on the contrary, decidedly to the rational side of the idea of God. Its implications admit of precise conceptual determination, and it springs from quite a distinct source. The difference between the, quote, feeling of dependence, end of quote, of Schleiermacher and that which finds typical utterance in the words of Abraham already cited might be expressed as that between the consciousness of createdness, Geschaffenheit, and the consciousness of creaturehood, Geschöpflichkeit. In the one case, you have the creatures as the work of the divine creative act. In the other, impotence and general nothingness as against overpowering might, dust and ashes as against majesty. In the one case, you have the fact of having been created, in the other, the status of the creature. And as soon as speculative thought has come to concern itself with this latter type of consciousness, as soon as it has come to analyze this, quote, majesty, end of quote, we are introduced to a set of ideas quite different from those of creation or preservation. We come upon the ideas first of the annihilation of self, and then as its complement of the transcendent as the soul in entire reality. These are the characteristic notes of mysticism in all its forms, however, otherwise various in content. For one of the chiefest and most general features of mysticism is just this self-deprecation, so plainly parallel to the case of Abraham. The estimation of the self of the personal I as something not perfectly or essentially real, or even as mere nullity, the self-deprecation which comes to demand its own fulfillment, in practice in rejecting the delusion of selfhood, and so makes for the annihilation of the self. And on the other hand, mysticism leads to a valuation of the transcendent object of its reference as that which through plenitude of being stands supreme and absolute, so that the finite self contrasted with it becomes conscious even in its nullity that, quote, I am not, thou art all, end of quote. There is no thought in this of any causal relation between God the Creator and the self the creature. The point from which speculation starts is not a, quote, consciousness of absolute dependence, end of quote, as myself as resultant effect of a divine cause, for that would in point of fact lead to insistence upon the reality of the self. It starts from a consciousness of the absolute superiority or supremacy of a power other than myself. And it is only as it falls back upon ontological terms to achieve its end, terms generally borrowed from natural science, that that element of the tremendum originally apprehended as plenitude of power becomes transmuted into plenitude of being.